Thanks, Seely, for introducing me, and also to thank Zohar for putting this together. This is a wonderful occasion, and it's really great to be here. Seely told you the topic of my talk, which is fiscal policy in an era of austerity. That's actually not my title. This is a title that comes from a symposium issue. And the thing about a symposium issue, and I almost never do them, but I'm very interested in their topics, so I decided to, is they basically want you to talk about the world and life and, solving the problems of the world in 5 pages. And this is not possible, and so the basic idea of the talk is I'm going to really focus on 4 different elements of a very big problem. So a quick survey in the paper, there's a quick survey of the problems facing our economy. I think those are really familiar, so I don't have to do that. I then want to talk about why it is so difficult to do a Keynesian stimulus successfully. Then the third point I make is to talk about cutting the corporate tax, which I think is an important step in a broader effort that we need to repair the US tax code. And then the last thing I talk about is some institutional mechanisms for helping our government use its money more effectively and basically to make better decisions. But as for the bad economy, again, it's very familiar. We know too many people paid too much money for residential housing. Loans were made that shouldn't have been made. Prices collapsed. Financial institutions failed, and the US economy and the global economy have been sluggish ever since. And the human costs are really quite awful. US unemployment just ticked up to 8.2% for May. Nearly half of the people who are out of work in the United States have been out of work for 6 months or more. There's another 2.5 million people who've given up looking for work, and then another 8 million people who are involuntarily working part-time. And if you put all those people together, it represents about 1/6 of the population in the US. It's about 15%. In addition to this persistently high unemployment in the United States, I think you all know the US government is setting records in its deficit spending. Again, it's familiar, but if you actually look at the numbers, I think they're pretty eye-opening. So the last year of the Bush administration, the budget deficit was about $640 billion, and that at the time was an eye-popping number. But in 2011, it was actually $1 trillion more than that. It was $1.64 trillion, and that represents 43% of what the US government is spending. So almost half of the spending is financed by debt at this point. This is a deficit of 11% of GDP. It's the highest the US has seen since World War II. And it's 2.5 times what it was in 2008. We're spending 28% more money. The US national debt held by the public now represents 2/3 of GDP and growing. So both of these problems, unemployment and also the deficit, would be much different. They would both be dramatically improved if we could get our economic growth rate to climb. It was only 1.5% in 2011. This is disappointing because at this point in a recovery, it typically would be 2 or 3 times that level. So reviving economic growth is crucial. It's easy to say that. The question is how to do it. And so there's a traditional view within economics that we try to use Keynesian stimulus to restart the economy. Basic intuition is the government borrows money and then spends this money on goods and services. And there is, I'm sure we all know, a very heated debate among economists. It almost feels like a religious war at times if you read op-eds, with each side absolutely convinced that it's right. Obviously, when you see that, you should probably suspect it's not so simple on either side. But I do think there is a relative consensus in the literature, at least about why this is difficult to do well. And there are 4 aspects of that, and I'll just quickly go through the 4. First is there's a fairly robust debate about the multiplier. You spend $1 of deficit-financed spending, how much economic growth do you get? And there are some very optimistic studies that project as much as $1.50. And if you're going to get $1.50 of growth out of $1 of spending, that clearly seems worth doing. The problem is, though, that those studies tend to be based on assumptions that are ambitious, and most of the literature suggests that the results are lower, probably in the area of 0.7. And I think the best analogy is Japan, which has done 15 stimulus efforts in the last 20 years or so, and the empirical research there is between 0.6 and 0.7. But this is really connected to a second issue, and in ways I think it's the most important. It's how we use the money. And again, I think the op-eds are very much about whether it's too large or too small, and I think it's much more about whether it's smart or not smart. Because you really can prop up purchasing power in a way by just dropping $100 bills from a helicopter over a city. And that's not the right way to do it. What you really want to do is to create infrastructure or other programs that provide for long-term growth over the future. And that's part of where this becomes so difficult. So there was a goal with the US stimulus that was enacted in 2009 that a significant part of it was going to be used for infrastructure, but it really wasn't. And we come back to the phrase shovel-ready projects. The federal government didn't really have anything prepared. I mean, think about, I don't know if any of you have renovated a home or an apartment, but if you think about how long it takes to figure out how to do it and to line it up and then multiply that by the scale of these projects and then factor in the political dynamic, and it's just very, very difficult to do. So what the US government did is they decided to give grants to states, hoping that the states would themselves have shovel-ready projects. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it doesn't seem to be the way they spent their money. Mostly they spent their money to cover deficits in Medicare and Medicaid, health-related programs, and also to pay down their own debt. So there wasn't really very much infrastructure in the stimulus. And then the third point is that whatever we do, we want the projects to be motivated by economic principles instead of by politics, but that's very difficult. And I'll come back to Japan because there are a lot of studies there. As I said, there are 15, and they were allocated in different ways, and they were located in different parts of the country. And the evidence is pretty clear that the infrastructure projects in Tokyo tended to produce more growth than some of the other projects. And I actually have never seen these, but I've read about them, maybe some of you have. There are these large sports stadiums in remote parts of Japan and airports that are never used. And the argument people make is it's about the political structure in Japan. There were compromises. Some of this money was allocated to out-of-the-way districts because influential politicians wanted it, and those, not surprisingly, didn't really contribute to economic growth in the same way that the infrastructure projects in Tokyo did. Well, if you look at the 2009 stimulus in the United States, unfortunately, the results are not terribly encouraging. I'll mention two projects that were supposed to feature prominently, and you might have read about them. One of them was to build a high-speed rail between Tampa and Orlando. And I wonder how many people have been to either Tampa or Orlando in the room. You will notice there is no subway in either city, and bus service is very limited. So while this program was intended to cut 30 minutes off of the travel time, it takes about 85 minutes to drive, it takes about 55 minutes on a train. The problem was you'd have to arrive and rent a car. And so to save a half hour, but then to rent a car, people were going to drive anyway. It really wasn't very sensible. Why did they do this? There are two reasons. One is the government of Florida already owned, and the US government owned, a lot of right-of-way, so it would have been easier to get the project started. And the other reason is, of course, that Florida is a politically important state in the United States, and I guess people thought it would be useful to channel a lot of federal money there. The project ultimately died because the governor of Florida didn't want to be responsible for cost overruns, so the $1.25 billion that was going to be spent wasn't spent. I think that's a good thing. But there's a second project which was to extend part of the subway system in San Francisco. This also got some attention. It's a 1.7-mile extension, $1.6 billion, so it's just about $100 million per tenth of a mile. And in principle, it could have been a good idea, but the problem was the connection to the rest of the system was not good. You had to go 8 stories down to get this connection. You had to walk a quarter mile. So the studies suggested that it would always be 10 minutes faster to take the bus regardless of where you were going. So why do this? Well, it probably isn't irrelevant that Nancy Pelosi's district was the place where this was going to occur. So my point is, politically motivated uses of money are not likely to generate the economic growth that we're looking for. And then the fourth point is familiar. It really is that even if you solve all these problems, there are some traditional costs of deficits. You might discourage economic growth just because people are worried about the future taxes that they'll have to pay. My own view is that that one is more manageable, and the textbook on this is you just have to figure out a long-term plan to deal with the deficit. It's not something the United States has done yet, but I hope they can. In any event, I do think that a fiscal stimulus is not sort of a magic bullet to solve these problems, and we're probably better off focusing more on sort of solving fundamental problems. So in that spirit, I'll mention two that I think are particularly ripe for solution. One is cutting the US corporate tax rate. It's currently, the marginal rate is 35% in the US. It's the highest in the OECD. Israel is 24, which is just about the median. Israel and Austria together are the median, 24 and 25. The UK is 26, Italy is 27, Korea 22. And I think it's a bad idea for the United States to have the highest corporate tax rate for 3 reasons. One is there are a lot of studies that show that lower corporate taxes do inspire more investment and more hiring, and there's studies not only by good friends of mine like Glenn Hubbard, who are sort of thought to be on the Republican side of this. Christina Romer, who is the head of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, actually wrote one of the most influential studies. It was published in 2010, and she shows that there are actually very significant effects on economic growth from increasing taxes. Her quote is, "The most striking finding is that tax increases have a very large effect on investment." Second reason to cut corporate taxes is that there's a lot of planning that goes along with cutting your effective rate. People aren't paying the marginal rate anyway, but it's pretty wasteful the way they navigate the system. And so if you look at the effective rates within the United States, different sectors pay different amounts. Retailers are 31%, mining is 6%, financial services 20%, and it's just not good policy. There's no reason why we should think that the tax system ought to favor one sector over the others. Much better, I think, to have a lower rate for all, but to have it enforced in a way that's strict and effective. And that brings me to my third point, which is really the one that motivates me most, and it's about the international tax system. U.S. multinationals. If you look at, Kim Klausing, an economist, did a very interesting study where she said, where are U.S. multinationals hiring people? And outside of the US. And the list of countries will not surprise you. It's places like the UK, Canada, Mexico, China, and Germany, where they're really doing business. But then she said, okay, where are they reporting their profits? Well, it won't surprise you to know it's not those countries. Countries like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Bermuda, Switzerland, Singapore, all with effective rates of 4% or below. So there's a lot of income shifting. Reuven can tell you how it's done. In fact, he has already written a lot on the subject. But I think we would just be much, much better off if we had tough rules policing things like transfer pricing and a much lower corporate rate overall. I think we would see real advantages in that. Now, there really are, there's more to say about that, but I want to leave time for questions. So I will simply say there are 2 arguments that worry people about cutting the US corporate tax rate. One has to do with distribution, and the assumption there is that the corporate tax is really a tax on wealthy people, and by cutting it, we're interfering with the distribution of income that we want to see. But I think that that's an unsophisticated view. For one thing, we don't really know what the economic incidence of the corporate tax is. Even if you assume it's on investors, a lot of the investors are pension funds. Those are really not wealthy people. But the evidence is increasingly suggesting that it falls more on labor than it does on capital, because labor is less mobile. And certainly there, the distribution argument looks very different. There's also a point about revenue. Can we do without the money? There's a study that was done not long ago showing that every time the OECD, a country in the OECD, had increased its tax rate by 1%, it collected 3% less revenue. So that the net effect of that is that they only got about 25 to 30% of the income that they were expecting to get from the increase. It might be that a tax cut wouldn't be as costly as we think it would be for the same reason if people gave up on some of the planning strategies. But in any event, we would have to make up some of that revenue. The other point that I wanted to emphasize is a more general one, but it has to do with our budget process. Because I think part of what we should be doing to pay for the corporate tax cut that I'm talking about is to eliminate a lot of these uneconomic, sort of pork-like tax expenditures that exist in the system. But it's a more general point. We need to make our government spending count. So if we want to have a stimulus that really works, or if we want to try to address the deficit, either way, we want to try to think about projects that sort of produce the maximum public benefit that we're looking for and at lowest cost. And my view is that we're not doing this well. But more importantly, the American people seem to think we're not doing it well. And the Gallup poll done in September is interesting. They said to 1,000 Americans, how much of every dollar of spending by the government do you think is wasted? And the number this time was the highest in history, 51 cents. American people think 51 cents out of every dollar is being wasted. I don't even think it's that bad, but I think it's bad. And the dynamics holding us back are familiar. Some of it is information, but I would focus more on incentives. I think political leaders are very tempted to try to please interest groups. And if you take a penny from every American every day for a year, a penny from every American every day for a year, it's $1 billion. Interest groups are good at mobilizing those pennies. We don't really notice that they're taking it. And so the point is we need to try to change the incentives of our leaders. So I have 3 ideas along those lines. One draws on Dan's work, and it's about better disclosure. I think we all know that Congress in the US and other governments play games with budget windows to try to make the cost of something seem lower than it really is, and I think better rules there would help a lot. I would also think we should have a special committee within the legislature that's responsible for identifying waste and suggesting that it be cut, sort of internal monitor. You could give them varying ranges of authority. One possibility is a sort of a low power kind of approach. Just give them the authority to publicize particular things that they don't think are a good idea. This is happening, these are the sponsors of the bill, and just the shaming might discourage some of this. Second possibility is you strip out particular measures and require a special vote so that the people who really want these pork items would have to vote on record for them and them alone. And then a third idea would be something like a line item veto, but within Congress itself. And the basic idea would be this committee could itself strike things from the budget. Just about all the US states have line item vetoes. The federal government tried it in the 90s, but the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, and the reason is the president was given this authority. But if Congress is given the authority, the same constitutional issues don't arise. An analogous idea is we could rely on independent commissions. May have followed the base closing challenge in the United States. It was unpopular to close bases. Basically, Congress just delegated this to a commission of independent experts and gave themselves only an up or down vote, and a number of bases were closed. Bowles-Simpson was an effort at this, sort of an independent commission to try to think of ways to deal with the deficit. They had some good ideas, but I don't think really it's been the focus of Congress's attention lately. And that just brings me to the last idea I wanted to suggest, which is to revive PAYGO. And some of you probably know very well what PAYGO was, but many don't. It basically was a rule passed in 1990 that said every time Congress wanted to either lower a tax or institute a new spending program, they had to raise a tax or cut a spending program. To do something for one group, they had to take away something for another group. And it was quite effective. And so over the 10 years when we had PAYGO, we went from a significant deficit to a surplus in 2000. And that was the point when PAYGO was revisited, and the Congressional Budget Office was forecasting surpluses as far as the eye can see. And so Congress let PAYGO expire, and obviously things have changed since then, but I think we should bring it back.